Hello everyone and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So today we're gonna go over the last video of the chapter, which is about hormones. So hormones are responsible for many different types of behavior, and in this video we're gonna talk about the hierarchical control of hormones, different classes of functions, behavioral functions of hormones, the HPA axis, and the hippocampus, and stress. Okay, so hormones operate within a hierarchy that begins when the brain responds to a sensory experience and cognitive activity. So it starts off in the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus produces neurohormones that will then stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete releasing hormones into the circulatory system. So the pituitary gland will release these hormones into our bloodstream. So these pituitary hormones in turn will influence the remaining endocrine glands to release appropriate hormones into our bloodstream. So these hormones then act on various targets or organs in the body, and they will send feedback to the brain about the need for more or less hormone release. So it's like a big cycle. Hormones do not only affect body organs, but they also target our brain. And they also target the neurotransmitter activating systems there. Almost every neuron in the brain contains receptors on which various hormones can act. So let's say, for example, testosterone. Testosterone has effects on physical appearance, but it also has neurotransmitter-like effects on brain cells that it can target. So especially neurons that control, for example, male sexual behavior and also aggression. Testosterone is transported into these neuron cell nuclei where it can even activate these genes. And these genes in turn will trigger the synthesis of proteins that are needed for cellular processes that produce male behaviors. So although many questions remain about how hormones produce complex behaviors, the diversity of testosterone function clarifies why the body uses hormones as messengers. So the targets of hormones are super widespread, and the best way of reaching all these target organs is through the bloodstream. And the blood goes everywhere, so it's the easiest way to get everywhere. So hormones can be used as drugs or to treat and prevent diseases. In our bodies, in the human body, there are as many as 100 hormones that are classified chemically either as steroids or peptides. So steroid hormones such as testosterone and cortisol are synthesized from cholesterol, and they are lipid soluble, so they can go into fat layers. Steroids diffuse away from their sites of synthesis in glands, including like your gonads, adrenal cortex, and the thyroid, and then they can easily cross cell membranes because they are lipid soluble. So they can then enter target cells just as easily because they're lipid soluble, and they can act on the cell's DNA to increase or decrease protein production. Peptide hormones are a little bit different. An example of a peptide hormone is insulin, or growth hormones, and also endorphins. So peptide hormones, they are made by cellular DNA, technically the same way that proteins are made. So they influence their target cells' activity by binding to metabotropic receptors on the cell membrane. And then they will generate a second messenger that will affect the cell's physiology. So we talked about these metabotropic receptors a while back. So I put a little picture here, but if you forgot, feel free to go back to that video. Okay, so these are some main glands that release these hormones. Most of them make sense, but for now I want you to 100% remember the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal gland. So the hypothalamus you can see right here, pituitary gland is right here, and the adrenal gland sits right above the kidney. And you have a cortex, which is the outside, and you have the medulla, which is the inside. And in case you didn't know at this point, cortex means bark, like tree bark. Steroid and peptide hormones, they can fall into one of three main functional groups with respect to behavior. So we have homeostatic hormones, which maintain internal balance. We have gonadal hormones, which serve reproductive functions. And we have glucocorticoid hormones, such as cortisol. And these are stress hormones. So let's go over these in a little bit more detail. So homeostatic hormones maintain a state of internal metabolic balance, and they regulate physiological systems in an organism. So mineral or corticoids such as aldosterone control both the concentration of water in blood and cells and the level of sodium, potassium, and calcium in the body. So on top of that, they also promote digestive functions. A typical homeostatic function, for example, is controlling blood sugar levels. So there's a group of cells in the pancreas, and they release insulin, which is a homeostatic hormone that causes blood sugar levels to fall by instructing the liver to start storing glucose rather than releasing it. And it can also instruct cells to increase glucose uptake. So the resulting decrease in glucose then decreases the stimulation of pancreatic cells so that they will stop producing insulin. So in diabetes or diabetes mellitus, there is a failure in these pancreatic cells. So they do not produce enough, or sometimes they don't produce any insulin, and blood sugar levels can either fall, which is called hypoglycemia, or they can rise and get super high, and this is called hyperglycemia. Okay, so moving on to the second one, gonadal sex hormones control reproductive functions, and they technically instruct the body to develop as a male. So, for example, using testosterone or using estrogen, they will tell the body to develop as a female. They will influence sexual behavior and also the conception of children. In women, progesterone and estrogen control the menstrual cycle, and gonadal hormones in women will also control birthing of babies and the release of breast milk with, for example, prolactin and oxytocin. And then the last one, glucocorticoids, such as cortisol. They are a group of steroid hormones that are secreted in times of stress. So they are important in protein and carbohydrate metabolism and in controlling sugar levels in the blood and the absorption of sugar by the cell. So hormones activated in physiologically challenging events or emergency situations will prepare the body to cope by either fighting or fleeing. Okay, so I wanted to go over the HPA axis. I'm sure you guys have already read about this many times in your biology textbooks, but let's go over it again. So the HPA axis is really important for fighting stressors. HPA axis stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis because it mainly consists of these three structures. And it is the best known for its role in our body as a reaction to stress. The HPA axis includes a group of hormone secreting glands from the nervous system and the endocrine system. So these are, as I just said, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. So the hypothalamus, we talked about it a lot, but let's go over it again. The hypothalamus is a tiny structure. It's a neuroendocrine structure located just above the brainstem. It technically controls the release of hormone from the pituitary gland, so it's kind of like a gatekeeper. And The pituitary gland is a hormone secreting gland, and it's just below the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland can release hormones into the bloodstream to reach a variety of targets. And in the HPA axis, hormones released from the pituitary gland will travel all the way down to the kidneys, and then they will influence the secretion of hormones from the endocrine gland called the adrenal glands, which are right on top of the kidneys. So here you see the hypothalamus, and then you see down here, you see the pituitary gland. And then if you go all the way down the body, you have the kidneys. And on top of the kidneys, you have these beautiful adrenal glands. So the primary function of the HPA axis is to regulate the stress response. So when we experience something stressful, the hypothalamus releases a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, or for short, CRH. CRH will signal the pituitary gland to secrete a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or in short, ACTH. And it will release that into our bloodstream. So ACTH will travel all the way down to the adrenal glands, and there it will prompt the release of a hormone called cortisol. And then this cortisol hormone is released from the cortex of the adrenal glands. So it's released from the outer layer, so only of the outer layer of the adrenal glands, not of the inside. And the release of that cortisol will cause a number of changes in the body that will help our body deal with the stressor. For example, it can mobilize energy such as glucose, so the body has enough energy to cope with the prolonged stressor. And when cortisol levels in the blood get too high, it is sensed by receptors in areas in the brain like the hypothalamus and also in the hippocampus. And these structures will then signal to the hypothalamus again, and it will shut off the stress response to what is known as a negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so a stressor is technically a stimulus that challenges our body's homeostasis, and it will trigger some form of arousal in us. So it begins when the body is subjected to a stressor, and especially when the brain perceives a stressor and responds with arousal. And then we have two different sequences that happened. We technically just briefly went over one, but let's go over both of them together. So we have the fast response and we have the slow response. What we just talked about, the HPA axis, is the slow response. So in the fast response, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is activated to prepare the body and its organs for fight or flight. And the parasympathetic division is technically inhibited, so your rest and digest is kind of turned off. So in addition to the sympathetic division, it will also stimulate the medulla on the interior area of the adrenal gland to release epinephrine, or what we also call that adrenaline. So adrenaline, when it's increased, so whenever you have an epinephrine surge, it prepares the body for a sudden burst of activity. So you have more energy to be active. So among many other functions, epinephrine or adrenaline also stimulates cell metabolism, so the body is more ready for action. Okay, and then the other one, we just went over that, but the hormone controlling the slow response is the steroid cortisol. And again, cortisol is a glucocorticoid, and it's released from the cortex or the outer layer of the adrenal gland. So the cortisol pathway is activated very slowly. Sometimes it takes minutes, sometimes hours. And cortisol has a wide range of functions, including turning off all bodily systems that are not immediately required to deal with a stressor. So for example, cortisol will turn off insulin so that the liver can start releasing glucose. And that will temporarily increase the body's energy supply so we can use that for activity. It will also shut down reproductive functions and inhibit the production of the growth hormone. So in this way, the body's energy can be solely concentrated on dealing with the stressor. So here's what I technically just went over. So on the left, in purple, you have the fast-acting pathway. So let's go through that. So the hypothalamus sends a neural message through the spinal cord. The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is activated to stimulate the medulla of the adrenal gland. That will release epinephrine from the inside of the adrenal gland, so the medulla is inside, into the circulatory system. And then epinephrine will activate the body's cells. And then we have the slow-acting pathway. So the hypothalamus releases CRF into the pituitary gland, and that will release ACTH onto the cortex of the adrenal gland. So remember, the slow-acting pathway is on the outside, so the cortex of the adrenal gland. Fast-acting is on the medulla of the adrenal gland. The cortex of the adrenal gland will release cortisol into the bloodstream, and cortisol will activate the body cells. So epinephrine will stimulate cell metabolism so that the body is ready for action, and cortisol helps deal with the stressor. So for example, it will turn other systems off, like the growth hormone or our reproductive system. So normally, stress responses are super brief. The body has a stressor, the body will mobilize its sources, deal with the challenge, and then it will shut it down. So it will stop the stress response, because you can't stay in a stress response forever. If a stress response is not shut down, the body will continue to mobilize energy at the cost of energy storage. So for example, proteins are used up, and this will result in muscle wasting and fatigue. The growth hormone is inhibited, and the body cannot grow. The gastrointestinal system is also shut down, and this will reduce the intake of and processing of nutrients to replace the used resources. The reproductive system is also inhibited, and the immune system is also suppressed, so this can increase possibilities of infection and disease. So being in stress for too long is not good. So the hippocampus also plays a really important role in turning off this stress response. So here you see a little diagram. So whenever there is too much cortisol, the hippocampus will technically give a negative feedback to the HPA axis, and that will lower the cortisol levels. So when there's too much cortisol in the bloodstream, it will go to the hippocampus. The hippocampus tells the hypothalamus to stop sending CRH. It contains a high density of cortisol receptors, and its axons projects to the hypothalamus. So this is of the hippocampus. So the hippocampus regulates cortisol, but it can also be damaged by stress. So whenever there's too much stress, it can damage the hippocampus, and cells can die off. And then the hippocampus will not be very good at turning off the stress, this whole stress signal. So again, it's not very good to have prolonged stress in your life. However, a little cortisol is always good. So you definitely need cortisol for focus and energy. So for example, whenever you're studying for an exam or finishing an assignment or public speaking, you need a little bit of cortisol to put you on task. It also lets the body focus on a stressor and pauses other functions. So for example, if you're in the forest and you see a big bear, you have to be able to run away from it rather than be distracted by other things. So here you see a performance curve. So here you see a performance level. Here you see the stress level. You can see a little bit too little stress is not good. Then you have eustress, which is the perfect amount. And then if you have even more stress, you will get fatigued, distracted, exhausted, etc. Eventually, it will lead to a breakdown. Okay, so I already went over this, but this was a cool picture, so I wanted to add it in too. So we talked earlier about how the hippocampus can turn off the stress response. So whenever there's stress, there's a lot of cortisol. Whenever there's more cortisol secretion, it will in the beginning be sent to the hippocampus. The hippocampus senses it, and it will sense feedback being like, whoa, too much cortisol, I need to shut this down. However, if there is too much cortisol secretion, this will break down hippocampal neurons, and with less hippocampal neurons, there will be a decreased ability to shut down this cortisol secretion. So it's kind of like a vicious cycle. Okay, so that was the last slide of this video. And yeah, that was it for this chapter.